Welcome to Caspian Tides, the Caspian Policy Center's new monthly podcast unpacking important developments in Central Asia and the South Caucasus. My name is Nicholas Castillo, and I'm a program officer at CPC and the host of Caspian Tides. On our inaugural episode, we unpack trends surrounding Islamic State Khorasan Province, the Afghan offshoot of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, an organization that has captured headlines around the world, with deadly attacks throughout South Asia, Iran, Russia, and Europe. In our first interview, I'll speak with Dr. Tricia Bacon, professor at American University and an expert on the organizational aspects of terror groups. We'll speak about ISKP's origins, recruitment, and what exactly makes the group so dangerous. Next, we welcome Dr. Gavin Helf, senior Central Asia expert at the United States Institute of Peace, who will report back on his recent involvement at a C5 workshop focusing on extremism and ISKP. So, without further introduction, I take you to our first interview with Dr. Tricia Bacon. Dr. Tricia Bacon is an associate professor at American University's School of Public Affairs. She directs the Policy Anti-Terrorism Hub at American University and has over 10 years of counterterrorism experience at the Department of State. She is the author of two books, Terror in Transition, Leadership and Succession in Terrorist Organizations, published in 2022, and Why Terrorist Organizations Form International Alliances, published in May 2018. Dr. Bacon is a non-resident associate fellow with the International Center for Counterterrorism and additionally serves on the Countering Terrorism and Extremism Program Advisory Council for the Middle East Institute. She also contributes to a number of publications on extremism, terrorism, and counterterrorism. Dr. Tricia Bacon, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's great to be with you today. Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to jump straight into a discussion of not ISKP, which is the center of our conversation today, but original ISIS in the Levant. So this terrorist group famously emerges in the mid-2010s and stakes this massive claim to Syria and Iraq and builds this short-lived so-called caliphate. Now ISKP, as the name would imply, emerges out of this, but is a branch local to what its members term Khorasan, which is to say Afghanistan and some surrounding areas. So can you, as somebody who wrote a book on terrorism in transition, actually, can you walk us through what's different between ISKP and ISIS? How does ISKP emerge from, ISIS classic, you might say?
Yeah, and I think that raises a couple really interesting points. First is the name itself, the Khorasan. It features in ISIS's narrative, right, about its sort of conquering and its building of the caliphate. These black banners will come out of Khorasan. So when the Islamic State is seeking these, what it calls provinces, what in the Al-Qaeda vernacular we call affiliates, what we see happening is it creates alliances with a number of organizations. And some of them were existing organizations like Boko Haram, and some of them are organizations that essentially form as ISIS affiliates. And that's what we see happen in South Asia. And again, there's a little bit of fluidity to what ISIS means when it talks about the Khorasan. In this context, it seems to apply to parts of Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Central Asia. It's sort of a vague idea of this overall region. But where it really gains traction is in Afghanistan and sort of the tribal areas of Pakistan. And when ISKP forms, it's not really an organization at first. It's a coalition of defectors from other existing organizations. And it's got sort of a tough road to hoe in order to carve out space. Because in Pakistan, you have dozens of militant organizations, right? It's a pretty competitive militant group environment. And in Afghanistan, you have really the overwhelming dominance, a monopoly for the Afghan Taliban. So initially, when we start hearing noises about an ISIS affiliate in South Asia, I think to myself, well, this is not going to be easy. But it does succeed in attracting pledges from an array of defectors and factions in the region. Defectors from the Pakistani Taliban, defectors from the Afghan Taliban, and defectors from foreign militant groups that operate in the region. And so it's sort of initially this umbrella organization of a bunch of different factions that call themselves the Islamic State in Khorasan Province. And it initially has to build ties with ISIS-Core and does so pretty extensively. It is one of the affiliates that we know ISIS-Core provided a lot of assistance, advising, training to help it build into a coherent organization.
So you mentioned that ISKP is made up of defectors from other organizations, and listeners might be familiar with this, that back in summer of 2021, when ISKP sort of first broke through into Western headlines, one of the phrases that was thrown around a lot was more radical than the Taliban, which for like a layman or a Westerner, it can be very difficult for us to understand how an Islamist group could be more radical than the Taliban. What are the central cleavages that defectors are breaking away from the Taliban based on?
I think there's two components to this. One is the ISIS-Core effort to delegitimize the Taliban, right? Because within al-Qaeda circles, the Taliban has been sort of the authority in the network, right? Al-Qaeda claims, swears bayat to the Afghan Taliban. So do most of al-Qaeda's affiliates. So the Taliban really had pride of place in the al-Qaeda network. And so one of the things that the Islamic State is trying to do at the outset is delegitimize the Taliban by itself and by inserting a competitor into the same region. And the timing of it was particularly beneficial because it came at a time where Mullah Omar, the founder of the Taliban's death in 2013, was just made public in 2015. And it was a huge embarrassment to the Taliban leadership that they had hidden his death. They had put out statements, in his name and really represented him as being alive. So this really sent shockwaves through the Taliban. And so this is one of the sources of defection that we see the Afghan Taliban defectors from multiple regions, from the east, from the south, from the west, and the north. Primarily the east and to a lesser extent the north, but really initially from all regions. So that's one major source of defections from the Taliban. At the same time, the Pakistani Taliban had essentially undertaken a lot of losses. They had a number of leadership losses. They had a huge military ouster from North Waziristan and South Waziristan. And so the defections from that organization come from a weakened place as well. So the Islamic State, as I mentioned, really carves out this place in the east, and they distinguished themselves from the Taliban fairly early on with how indiscriminate their violence is. They are willing to attack sort of the softest of targets, at the same time that the Taliban is trying to present itself as a legitimate authority, right? A rival to the Afghan government. So it's starting to calibrate its violence differently and trying to win public compliance, if not support. Whereas ISIS has no qualms really about hitting very soft targets, high levels of casualties in its attacks. And ISKP is also extremely sectarian, as one might expect coming from the ISIS brand, where the Taliban is trying to avoid that kind of violence. Again, it's trying to present itself as a national authority of sorts. So the point at which ISKP emerges, the Taliban is sort of maturing as an insurgent organization to calibrate its violence differently, whereas ISKP from the outset comes out and is attacking very soft targets, is highly sectarian in its targeting. And when it controls territory, it solely relies on coercion, right? Mm-hmm. It's not doing a lot of service provision. It's not very sophisticated in its governance. It's really just a highly, highly coercive organization. It doesn't succeed in holding on to territory for very long because it's faced with Taliban opposition, U.S. counterterrorism efforts, and Afghan Republic government counterterrorism efforts. So it's getting pressure from all sides. But the images that came out of ISKP-controlled territory of things it was doing to punish elders who were not complying with the group, for example, were really gruesome and were a level of violence and sort of celebration of violence that the Taliban was moving away from as it sought to be a more accepted internationally and accepted nationally insurgent entity.
Yeah, fascinating. And the idea of the Taliban as sort of a moderating and seeking out legitimacy, it dovetails nicely with recent headlines about Taliban representatives being accepted in the United Arab Emirates and Kazakhstan quite recently, but also in the context of ISKP's sort of debut internationally was in August 2021 after the Taliban had signed an agreement with the Trump administration, which it's very, very difficult to imagine ISKP taking on that same kind of agreement. I'd like to pivot a little bit to what's going on at the very moment. And you already mentioned that initially ISKP is sourcing fighters from Taliban defectors. But what do we know right now about who is joining ISKP and why, and the extent to which that's sort of a transnational recruitment pool? And I'm asking in particular because a lot of the highest profile ISKP attacks of late, and this is something that's very relevant to our organization at CPC, we're covering Central Asia to a great extent, appear to be Tajik nationals. So Tajik nationals were responsible for the Kerman bombing that killed about 90 people in Iran this winter. And then more recently, supposedly the Caucasus City Hall attacks in Russia that killed approximately 150 people. Supposedly that was conducted by Tajik migrants, though there seems to be a little bit more confusion around whether or not that's a legitimate claim. But if you look at a list of, ISKP fighters whose nom de guerre last name is Al-Tajiki, it's a pretty long list, surprisingly so. So to what extent is ISKP getting recruits from Central Asia?
That's the third element of ISKP when we talk about its initial formation, right? It's defectors from the Afghan Taliban, it's defectors from the Pakistani Taliban, and it's also defectors from foreign militant groups operating in Afghanistan. And so one of the things that goes back to the 1990s is the prominence of Central Asian foreign fighters in Afghanistan. Under the Taliban regime in the 1990s, Central Asian foreign fighters really had prominence. There was a large cadre of them. And in fact, when the Taliban was anointing the leader of foreign fighters, it didn't anoint Osama bin Laden as the leader of foreign fighters. It anointed the head of the major Uzbek group, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. So there is a long standing presence of Central Asian foreign fighters in Afghanistan. They were involved in the insurgency, supporting the Taliban. They helped the Taliban make inroads in the north, where they had ethnic Afghan Uzbeks and ethnic Afghan Tajiks. So they were really playing this important role. But when ISKP emerges, there's also pressure in the Taliban's relationship with these Central Asian groups, because the Taliban is really presenting itself as a nationalist organization that is seeking international legitimacy, and thus is not really supporting their ambitions back home. These are foreign fighters who've been in Afghanistan or to some degree Pakistan now for many years, if not decades, but a lot of them still had ambitions back home. And so when ISKP emerges, it provides an outlet for transnational ambitions at the same time that the Taliban is sort of putting a lid on them. And as we know, in subsequent years, it'll engage in these talks with the US where it will commit to preventing terrorism emanating from Afghanistan, which effectively is a commitment to contain the ambitions of some of these Central Asian foreign fighters that were in Afghanistan. So when you look at the breakdown of ISKP, to the degree that we understand it, we sort of generally understand it as has the most Pakistani Pashtuns, Afghan Pashtuns, and Central Asians. There's a very sizable Central Asian contingent that was part of the group from the very beginning, in part because of the embrace of a transnational ambition. So I think that it was essentially born with a Central Asian cadre, at the same time that the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria was attracting new lines of recruit from Central Asia, right? There was a lot of excitement about the caliphate and sort of the mission in Syria and Iraq. So the Islamic State was benefiting from attracting Central Asians in two really important ways. And so from its inception, ISKP had a lifeline to Central Asians through the ones present in Afghanistan and Pakistan already, at the same time as ISIS core attracted new ones. So Central Asians have been really important in ISIS far before they sort of became very prominent because of the roles that you mentioned in the attacks in Moscow and other plots that have been broken up.
To wrap things up a little bit, I'd like to point out a really interesting argument you make in an article you wrote for CSIS, and I'll link to it in the show notes here, where you talk about how an increasingly polarized and competitive and hostile international environment is hindering cooperation against orgs like ISKP. Can you break that down a little bit, how mistrust between global powers is impacting our ability to effectively fight terrorism?
It's one of the shifts that we see as a inadvertent consequence of the shift to strategic competition. When counterterrorism was such a prominent consideration for many states in the international system, including and particularly the United States, there was an effort and willingness to set aside areas of friction in order to cooperate on terrorism. And what we see is that is decreasingly the case, that strategic competition imperatives are dominating. And at the same time, the level of mistrust within the system has now bled over into counterterrorism. Some of that has some basis. There are plenty of states that use militant groups as proxies and that support them, my enemy of my enemy, or see strategic utility. You mentioned the axis of resistance. Of course, Iran is very involved in that kind of support for militant groups. So some of that does happen. But there is also increasingly lenses applied to these militant groups that reflect strategic competition. What do I mean by that? We see that the U.S. Warned Moscow and Tehran about ISKP attacks. And in both cases, neither government took sufficient action on those warnings to prevent the sizable attacks that subsequently came. And instead, both governments basically accused the U.S. of supporting ISKP. So now there isn't sort of a carve out for counterterrorism that, yes, we have other problems in the bilateral relationship, but when it comes to countering these groups, there's still some area for cooperation. Now those hostilities, that suspicion is now encompassing counterterrorism. And I also think that it is one of the limitations to cooperation with the Taliban on ISKP. Most governments in the region see ISKP as an instrument of their rival, right? And so the Taliban is among those that has said, the United States is supporting ISKP. Well, it's hard to cooperate with a government that thinks that you're supporting a militant group that is opposing it. That it doesn't leave a lot of space for cooperation, right? And the Taliban has also said that ISKP is working with the Pakistanis, and the Pakistanis say is working with India, and so on and so forth. So it's become a little bit of a pawn, though ISKP in reality is a fully rejectionist of all of these governments. Governments increasingly view it through the prism of their existing rivalries and sometimes just their conspiracies, as we see in the case of Moscow and Tehran. So unfortunately, the broader international environment doesn't have as much space for counterterrorism that crosses difficult bilateral relationships or rivalries or even hostilities that it did for a number of years when there was sort of a sense of shared threat from these groups. And ISKP has been the most adept at exploiting that and exacerbating that through its attacks.
Yeah. And it's interesting and fascinating and almost kind of bizarre to remember that after the 9/11 attacks, there was a pretty good deal of cooperation between Moscow and Washington, and even military cooperation. And well, it's a very different international system and international environment we're currently operating in. Dr. Tricia Bacon, thank you so much for all of your comments, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the chance to be on the episode.
Now to our second interview with Dr. Gavin Helf. Dr. Gavin Helf is a senior expert on Central Asia for the U.S. Institute of Peace, where he works on Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Before joining USIP, Dr. Helf worked as a senior democracy and governance advisor for USAID Asia and the Department of State, covering portfolios on democracy promotion and countering violent extremism. He has extensive experience with the Middle East and post-Soviet space, and most recently, and quite luckily for our conversation today, he just returned from a C5+1 workshop in Kazakhstan focusing on terrorism and counterterrorism issues. Dr. Helf, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, as I just mentioned, you returned from a workshop, a C5+1 workshop on extremism, titled C5+1 Working Group Workshop on Violent Extremism in Central Asia. From your recent time there, what was your impression of the way in which Central Asian officials are approaching the topic of extremism and terrorism?
The governments of the region take very different approaches to this, sometimes, within the same country. There is always sort of an old knee-jerk tendency to crack down strongly on outward expressions of religiosity in all of these countries. Like banning hijabs in schools, which Tajikistan recently did. Sometimes trying to force men to stop growing beards through social pressure. Much of this kind of crackdown approach is reinforced now by, this is something that actually came up at the conference. A lot of that sort of crude crackdown stuff is now being pushed through the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, by China, based on their experience doing similar things with Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And it reflects this kind of tendency among scholars and also government officials in the region to see a direct through line between sort of religious expression leading to fundamentalism, leading to extremism, leading to violence, leading to terrorism. So it's a very simplistic vision that religion ultimately, is a bad thing in society, and that's probably left over from the Soviet era. But on the other hand, there are also efforts by all the governments in this region to control religious institutions and co-opt religion for buttressing their own state power and for political purposes. So that leads to things like, the state building mosques, the state trying to hand imams their Friday sermons in a coordinated way and coordinate messaging, but also trying to sort of be overtly demonstrative about their own. Government leaders will show their own sort of religious faith by praying or attending mosque, and especially during times when there's an election. So there's a little schizophrenic attitude towards religion overall. It's probably in general over-securitized, and there's insufficient attention paid to the underlying grievances, which make people open for radicalization of their religious identities. I think the thing that is different, and throughout this meeting we were having last week, we were thinking about, what's changed, what's different than it was 10 years ago during the sort of ISIS heyday. And one of the big things is that in the past, the governments of this region were kind of okay if radicalization meant that you got your way to Turkey and went to Iraq and Syria, joined the Islamic State and disappeared, hopefully to, perish in some conflict in the Middle East. That was exporting radicalism, exporting extremism. But that's really not available now because there's no destination like Syria or Iraq. So there's a little bit of evidence that some Central Asians are going to join ISKP, ISIS, Khorasan in Afghanistan. But that's a different kind of threat because it's local. So one of the big differences is that right now they're not able to export radicalism, the way that they did 10 years ago.
Hit upon the pivot from the Middle East as the center of Islamic State activity to Afghanistan, to ISKP being sort of seen as the dominant threat and organizing structure. So part and parcel of that is a transformation of the Taliban's role in the Central Asian calculus. It's pretty fascinating. In the 1990s, Central Asian states were actually supporting the insurgencies against the Taliban and utilizing cross-border ethnic connections to local Tajiks and Uzbeks within Afghanistan. But now it's sort of a different situation. It's the reverse. The Taliban is seen as a much more moderate and stabilizing force compared to ISKP, who's active in the region. And we've seen some recent things. The charge d'affaires was recently accepted by Kazakhstan from the Taliban government. So where do you see Taliban-Central Asian relations going, and how do you think anti-terror cooperation fits into that calculus?
So it's there are very different approaches by the different governments of Central Asia, and the presidents of the 5 countries of Central Asia get together every year to sort of hash out their common agenda vis-a-vis the outside world. In part, it's really interesting to look at you can look at their meetings with China or the United States or Russia to see what they agree on, because they all have agreed talking points. If you look at what they talk about at these C5 meetings, you'll see the things that they haven't worked out an agreement on. And one of the biggest ones is, what do we do? What's our common approach to the Taliban and to Afghanistan? So, on one extreme, you have the Uzbeks following a process of engagement, de facto recognition, using really a theory of change that is, complex interdependence diplomatically, economically, creating dependencies on energy resources, on transportation, means that you'll be in a position to, evolve the Taliban's behavior. So that's the theory of the case that Uzbekistan has. And they've been, very clear about offering their good offices to help create, be an intermediary between the West and the Taliban. On the other extreme, you have the Tajiks who feel more threatened by the Taliban groups that have Tajik identity and ethnicity across the border, who have a real sort of non-recognition containment, build a wall, contain the Taliban. The Taliban is a threat ideologically and needs to be contained. I think what we've seen, that's been true since the Taliban took over, those two approaches. And I think something in the last, year, we've seen both with, ISKP, Islamic State, Khorasan, being able to sort of lead terrorist attacks from within Afghanistan, and with some other things that the Taliban have been able to do unilaterally, with the creation of, this is a kind of a separate off topic, but the creation of the Kosh Tepe Canal, which will draw up to 30% of the water out of the Amu Darya Basin, which then sort of shows that you can't contain a country that controls your sources of water, that controls your security environment unilaterally. So containment's not really working, and then evolution hasn't really shown a big change. The Taliban are acting very aggressively. So the different countries of the region approach it differently. The Uzbeks seem to have a kind of, the cat's out of the bag. So we've got to work with these guys, whether it's on water sharing and economic development or on counterterrorism. So there's probably a lot more cooperation. Then there's the sort of like, we have to contain them. So there's no like one particular approach. Not everybody's recognizing them, and I think you're going to continue to see sort of. One of our interlocutors described it sort of generously as a good cop, bad cop approach to the Taliban, but I think what it really reflects is very different ideas about how you contain and change the behavior.
Yeah. And I would point any interested listeners to recent publications by CPC's own Dr. Eric Rudenschulte, did a really good report on the sort of, especially on the economic and infrastructure side of Uzbek-Afghan cooperation, especially considering the fact that the Uzbeks have this long-running desire to access South Asian markets and ports, and they have to deal with Afghanistan in that context. You were kind enough to provide me with a couple of the questions that structured the discussions at the workshop in Kazakhstan that you attended. So I'd like to sort of just pull a couple of those and get your response to them and how they were discussed in Almaty. So first of all, what has changed in terms of grievance and radicalization in the last decade since ISIS and other extremist groups recruited large numbers of Central Asians to join them in Syria?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. The Islamic State went away and Central Asia stopped going to the Islamic State, but the underlying grievances for why they were looking for an outlet maybe haven't changed. So, if we go back, if we look, I think, there are a couple of reasons, a couple of sort of broad categories of grievances that we saw connected to foreign fighters who went to join the Islamic State. And those grievances are still there. Economic grievances. So, some of the regions and geographic areas that were most implicated in sort of sending foreign fighters to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria were, the sort of, Rust Belt, Jizkizgan, Karaganda in Kazakhstan, the Rust Belt areas with the old Soviet industry where there wasn't a lot of economic opportunity. There wasn't an awful lot of economic hope. And so you can make an economic argument, that some of the people who joined the Islamic State were doing it because of a lack of economic opportunity. Another category, certainly that we saw among the Uzbek minorities in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan was a lack of ethnic and nationalist inclusion of minorities. The Osh events, the Osh riots in Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyz against the minority Uzbeks, were sort of one of the first pushes that pushed Uzbeks who felt like they didn't have much of a voice or economic opportunities because of their ethnic identity, were among the first to really move out of the region and then, eventually wind up in large numbers relatively in the Islamic State. So ethnic nationalist inclusion problems. Labor migration and labor migrants, which was a really big one. The condition of labor migrants from Central Asia who send back remittances to Central Asia from Russia. The conditions are really bad. The conditions are only getting worse. These people are mistreated. There are not a lot of mitigating factors. They're very far away from all of the things that would usually help them socialize and integrate, like their own communities at home. So they become particularly vulnerable. One of the really interesting things, though, that we sort of pointed out that needed to be followed is back in the day with the Islamic State, all of these factors, economic, ethnic, labor migration, all of these factors, you could say there are a lot of people who fit into those categories, but there are a lot that didn't. So you might have, a village, a city in the south of Kyrgyzstan like Aravan, which is mostly Uzbeks, which was a really big area of recruitment for ISKP. You might have a town of similar size and similar quantity right next to it, or down the road a little bit where nobody did that. You might have, areas of economic, deprivation in Kazakhstan that were a big resource and a big geographic area for the Islamic State. And then a city similar to it where nobody went. They all maybe went, someplace else or went to St. Petersburg to drive taxis. So a lot of it had to do with the geographic locations, had to do with networking. And this was a piece that we picked up, back 10 years ago. There were certain areas where, maybe somebody started the process. We sometimes, sort of half jokingly refer to that as jihadi number 0, who then, used contacts back in that geographic area to pull people in. Very much like what labor migrants do from Central Asia throughout Russia. So, maybe the next town over, everybody went and became a taxi driver in St. Petersburg or worked in construction in Siberia. So that networking became really important. And one of the things that I think we need to learn more about is, as we look at this problem now, 10 years later, is are we seeing different geographic areas that are becoming sort of these network ties into those grievances?
Yeah, and it reminds me of a paper that I came across at some point that was pointing out that of the ISIS in the Levant recruits from Uzbekistan, there was a long-term study, and it found like a shockingly high percentage, I don't remember the exact number, were from just a handful of like
Yeah.
counties or sort of the
Yeah.
local equivalent of zip codes of these sort of
There's
politically and
very
economically.
very concentrated all
Yeah.
over, right? In all these countries, there are very concentrated sources.
Yeah. So another question that was discussed at this forum you provided me with was, and you already touched on this, but if you could expand more,
Yeah.
particularly on the recruitment and vulnerability of migrants within Russia. There's a lot of estimates that the number of Central Asian migrants in Russia are almost about 5 million, that it's a pretty marginalized and sort of beset population. And if you want to expand further on that, you've already mentioned this, a lot of the most recent and most devastating ISKP attacks abroad have been conducted by Tajik nationals. So this was the case in Iran, a recent shooting in Istanbul, as well as the Caucasus City Hall attacks were supposedly committed by Tajiks. So firstly, on the migrant point, if you could expand on that. And then secondly, what do you think it is particularly about Tajiks and Tajikistan that seems to be attracting them to ISKP in higher numbers?
Yeah, so the whole migrant thing was a real light bulb moment, 10 years ago when we started to see Central Asians pop up in the Islamic State. And I remember back at the time, when I was working for USAID, that in interagency discussions about, well, how do we do preventing violent extremism and preventing foreign fighters? And maybe we need more, youth programs in the Fergana Valley or cross-border community engagements, or things that we're all very much looking at Central Asia and work in Central Asia. And then we did a study. A friend of mine, Noah Tucker, who was at the conference, did a study for me at USAID that discovered that the vast majority of those foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria from Central Asia had been radicalized not in Central Asia, but had been radicalized as labor migrants in Russia, where their conditions were really bad. So that was a surprise back then. I think now what we're seeing is that the radicalization that people were talking about last week was basically probably not about labor migrants. So one of the factors, and this is maybe the first important sort of penciled in finding from our conversation last week, there's no evidence of hyper-targeted recruitment efforts online aiming at labor migrants. Now, 10 years ago, there were very focused ISIS attempts to, in Uzbek, in Kyrgyz, in Tajik language, to appeal to labor migrants in particular. Be a slave of Allah's, not a slave of Putin's. We're not seeing that now. Most of the online material that's coming out of ISIS-K and other radical groups is more generic. It's more sort of retread content from years ago, designed to sort of promote general disaffection and radicalization, maybe, but it's not specifically recruitment stuff aimed at migrants the way that it used to. So the first important sort of consensus from our group, I think, last week was that the visible online footprint of recruitment and radicalization is very small. It's very small compared to what we saw 10 years ago at the height of the Islamic State. And I think the second important observation related to this is that recruitment is likely happening face to face. And in part, it's happening in Central Asia itself, in the Central Asian region, which is different, both in the how and the where from what we saw maybe 10 years ago at the height of the Islamic State. It's the reason that I think everyone needs to be more concerned in the region, because if there's recruitment going on inside the region, radicalization going on inside the region, there's no natural outlet for it. They're not going to go off to Syria and disappear. They're going to be in the region thinking about what they can do, or trying to move to ISIS-K in Afghanistan. And then we go back, on the question of Tajiks. It's true that we saw in Iran, in Russia, and at different points in foiled plots attempts by ISIS-K, a disproportionate number of ethnic Tajik citizens. And I think this is the third important observation. It goes back to what I was talking about with networks. What I heard last week is that there's some evidence that while ISIS-K in Afghanistan is mostly a Pashtun organization, there are Tajiks involved, and there are Tajiks especially who are in the recruitment infrastructure for ISIS-K, and that they're very much, appear to be drawing on their networks for recruitment. So they're not recruiting as aggressively the Uzbeks or the Kyrgyz or the others who, might have grievances but are not connected to it. One of the gaps that we hope to fill in a little bit is trying to track how this is happening now, and what the geography and these network connections look like, so that we can understand a little bit more. And that's sort of one of the big research agendas that we have coming out of this conversation.
So on one final question, one final note, what would your policy recommendations be for Washington vis-a-vis counterterrorism in Central Asia today? Where are the gaps in counterterrorism, especially concerning ISKP? And what do you think would be good steps to fill them in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole universe of hard counterterrorism stuff, which I know, my former colleagues in state CT and the security services do, and that's a whole, whether it's counterterrorism financing controls or the actual sort of hard cooperation with the security organs in the region to actually stop travel and capture people along the way and give warning. That's a whole sort of separate thing that I don't really follow and know a whole lot about at USIP. And when I worked at USAID earlier, we were very much more on the prevention side of thing. And I'd like to sort of, point out a couple of areas that in both of those contexts I've worked on a little bit, and I think are really important to bear in mind, because they don't necessarily always reach the top of the list for the countries and the governments in the region. One is, the work that we've been doing with returnees. Central Asia was way ahead of the curve. The governments of the region were really quite ahead of the curve in bringing their people, the families of foreign fighters and some of the foreign fighters themselves, back from Syria and Iraq, trying to reintegrate the women and children into the community. And I think it's a very important topic, which is if they're going to be an object lesson, whether good or bad. If they reintegrate well, I think it helps go a long way towards preventing their story becoming something that gets picked up by those seeking to recruit others. If they fail in their reintegration, then they become a group that's potentially very dangerous. There are large numbers, tens of thousands of releasees from prison in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, people who were arrested 10, 15 years ago or longer on extremism charges that were often, fairly minor. Not people who went to Iraq and Syria, but people who were arrested on extremism charges and then released. They haven't had nearly as much of the state support and outside support for reintegration that returnees from Iraq and Syria have had. And then related to that, something that you always hear if you're doing CVE work, but I heard 3 or 4 times independently over the last week, which is that it may be that one of the real entry points for radicalization is within prisons. This is always the case, but that in Central Asia right now, you've got very organized extremist groups within the prison system that are able to recruit within the prison systems among the general population. So that's obviously something that we can help with and pay a lot of attention to. Gaza is an accelerant, and being able to, I think, solving the Gaza problem will take away a major propaganda piece for extremists. And then I think, in the long term, the United States needs to come to grips with, what happens if the Taliban is not able to control or unwilling to control access to managing operations outside the country to other than Taliban extremist organizations. That long to medium term petri dish problem with Afghanistan. In some way, the Taliban needs to be brought on board and not allowed to sort of recreate the environment that happened in the 1990s before 9/11.
Dr. Gavin Helf, interesting and important comments. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That's all for our episode today. Be sure to tune in next month in October when we'll have a new set of interviews for you focusing on a different topic. My name is Nick Castillo, and I'm a program officer at the Caspian Policy Center. And our guests today were Dr. Tricia Bacon of American University and Dr. Gavin Helf of the United States Institute of Peace. Thank you for listening.